Tom, we have a heartbreaking situation going on in Bosnia, in the Balkans, that needs to be addressed. We're reading more and more in the papers and seeing pictures on television of the terrible atrocities going on there. Talk of ethnic cleansing. It reminds many people of the Holocaust, the many detention camps that exist in that part of the world, torture being alleged, children being killed, women being raped and brutalized. It really is a frightening kind of picture that we see in that part of the world. And I think it might be helpful if we tried to get a little bit of perspective on the whole thing and try to realize the importance of the Balkans and history and look at it from a different perspective so we can get some sense maybe of what is going on there. So we have an area of the world that's extremely important. We have the Adriatic Sea on one side. We have a peninsula that juts down. We have the Black Sea over on the east. And we have the former Yugoslavia surrounded by Austria in the north and Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria as you're coming down on the east, and with Greece below, and Albania, very important. So we have a geographical area that we're trying to get in our mind to look at here. And then we're looking at Yugoslavia, created after the First World War as a political entity. Of course, the history goes back much further than that we might have to look at. So just sketching out that little bit of beginning, Tom, let's start to try to establish some perspective on this troubled spot we know as Bosnia.
Well, I think it's often been said that that area of the country historically has always been a powder keg of nationalities, and I think you've done a good job of, in a general way, of describing some of the geography and some of the history. The term Yugoslavia means land of the southern Slavs. It means southern Slav is what it means literally. But I think you pointed out a moment ago that Yugoslavia as a nation is an artificial and very recent creation. And to understand the roots of the terrible tragedy that you've described, the ethnic cleansing, the murderous assault by certain Serbian elements into Bosnia-Herzegovina, indeed into Croatia in 1989 and 1990, which brought the UN sanctions into existence, are but two examples of the kind of national violence of one people against another which has characterized life in that part of the country, in not only in recent history but in more remote history. So I think you're right. Before we can begin to come to grips with the basic issues now facing the United States, that is, should we continue to support the policies we have in that part of the country? Should we support the interdiction of flights over Bosnia to prevent Serbian aircraft from interfering with the humanitarian relief? Those kind of issues, what our policy should be, can't be done in a vacuum.
That's right. Let's go back, Tom, in history a little bit. We got to remember that part of the world was part of the Roman Empire. And in the late 4th century, I think it was 395, Diocletian decided to carve up the empire into two administrative groups, the West and the East, and that line ran roughly through the Balkan area that we're talking about here, in fact, right through Bosnia, and created already that split between East and West. And as we know, eventually, when Rome fell, then we had the creation of the Byzantine Empire, which Constantinople is the center of it, which is modern-day Istanbul, part of Turkey. And so right from then on, you kept getting this split between the East and West, so that what you find in the Balkans, in Bosnia, and that whole area of the country, are some people who look eastward to Europe and are generally Catholic, have been aligned themselves with Rome, and you have others who have looked to, they say, to the West, and others who have looked to the East, to Constantinople, and who are Orthodox Christians. So one of the splits that you see here is very important along that line. And not only did you get a difference in liturgical outlook and different perspectives, different languages used in the liturgy, but then in 1054 you got the official split between the East and the West. So now we get an even deeper division that's coming right down through the middle of this area that we're talking about. Just to complete that, Tom, before you jump back in, the other factor we have to get in here is the Ottoman Turks, the Ottoman Empire, Turkish Empire, which took over this area and gave us a great Muslim influence. So you remember the famous date 1453, the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, and which brought in the Muslim influence into the area. Thus, when we begin to read today, we're seeing, well, we have the Serbian Orthodox. They're looking to Constantinople, representative of Eastern Orthodoxy. We've got Croat and Slovenian Catholics, people who have remained loyal to Rome. And we have the Bosnian Muslims, about 47% of that country, who are influenced by Islam. So we've got a major mix here that's occurred historically, but mostly because of the split in the Roman Empire, between East and West, and eventually because of the Ottoman Turks coming in and bringing very often Islam, and many people forced to convert to the Islamic religion.
I think we can carry that down the ladder of from the good general background that you've just given us as to the basic historical forces at work there, and get down to describe some of the peoples involved in the tragedy that you referred to as Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia. And I think just responding to the lineup you've given us, we know that the former Yugoslavia included Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, actually parts of Macedonia, and six different republics.
Yeah.
And then down near Kosovo in the south was a heavy Albanian population. And if we look at those various groups, you can trace, for example, historically the Slovenians and the Croatians historically have been tied more to the Roman Catholic Habsburg influence. And then
which was often not benign, by the way.
Often not benign.
No, you have to remember that they often were intolerant.
Yes.
And sometimes it's been said that the Ottoman Turks, carrying the banner of Islam, was more tolerant than the Habsburg Catholics in dealing with religious groups that were different. So we have to keep that in mind.
I'm not sure I would agree with. That's not my reading of history. I don't mean to suggest that the Habsburgs always were the most civilized in their dealing with minorities or with dissent and so forth. I'm not trying to suggest that, but it's pretty hard to beat the Sultan and his military warlords in terms of their ability to mete out arbitrary punishment and to rule by force and decree. It's pretty hard to be more arbitrary than the Sultan, particularly in the days of as the Ottoman Empire declined and became more and more corrupt. But I think it's important to recognize that essentially, as you look at the history of the former Yugoslavia, it's the Slovenians and the Croatians that tend towards Western Habsburg Roman Catholic influence. And as you pointed out, then there are other elements, particularly in Serbia, which have split between in their religious traditions, at least, split between Byzantine Christianity, that's Greek Orthodox Christianity, and Islam as a result of the Turkish Ottoman ruling for 1,000 years. That the Ottoman Turks actually, I say 1,000, wasn't 1,000, it was 500 years. 500 years the Ottoman Turks had.
The end of their empire really comes with World War I.
With the end of World War I.
That's right.
Versailles and the Paris Conference following World War I.
Although Turkey, even before that, was defeated in many ways and moved out of the area, Turkey being the power that sort of carried Islam in those days.
Had been gradually being nudged out through history up till the time of the Second World War. It was not nearly what it had been. It was already a dying empire, but nevertheless it was fairly influential. And Jim, you might then go to set up the more recent history, you might then go to what happened at the Paris Conference.
Well, why don't you say something about that, and then that will move us eventually into World War II, which is also very important.
Sure. Go ahead. It kind of sets, it's kind of interesting because, of course, what happened was the great powers came there faced with the problem of trying to set up a new world order. That was
this is after the war.
After the war.
Tom, let me just interject to make sure we're keeping a fix on this, because this is so important for today. But the start of World War I actually goes back to Serbian nationalism, something we're facing again today with the killing of the Austrian Archduke Francis Ferdinand, and which then caused Austria to attack the Serbians. And so we get the beginning of World War I. So right in this area, that's why I often say the Balkans are really a fiery place. I mean, it's a volatile kind of place. And so World War I really gets started with Serbian nationalism killing the Archduke. And,
absolutely.
So that's why many people fear the same sort of thing today. They see a scenario where this thing could spread. I mean, especially if Albania comes into it, if the Serbians do indeed move into that area of Kosovo, where a lot of Albanians live. But I just wanted to get that historical piece in there before you go to the very important part of the peace treaty and where that
I think
took
you're
us.
right. I think I probably should have brought that up, because it was, of course, you'd even have to go back further than that to realize that as of the date that the Archduke in 1914, it was June of 1914, that the Archduke was assassinated at Sarajevo, and it's known that it was done by a Serbian, and it was done with the encouragement of some forces outside of Serbia, but it was done by a Serbian nationalist.
That's right.
And it was done in basically out of nationalistic hatred for the Habsburgs. Essentially, it was what it was. It was an attack on the long term. We're almost now at the end of the Habsburg 700 years of Habsburg rule in that part of the country. But you're absolutely right. That Serbia, of course, had strong, being a Slavic nation, had strong support from the Russians, and the Russians had an alliance with France. And what happened after the assassination of the Archduke was that Germany immediately came in and the Kaiser came in and gave its unqualified support to Austria. The Austrians began to mobilize, the Russians began to mobilize, and that was events tumble out of control, and that led eventually to the First World War. Set in train the events which led to the First World War. But and then after the victory over the Axis powers by the Allies, we had the of course famous.
Incidentally, Turkey is defeated as part of that. So that's this end of the Ottoman Empire, the Islamic Empire that had ruled for so long, for 500 years, and was really the dominant modern state in one sense, touching parts of Europe and Africa and Asia, a monstrous kind of state, Ottoman Empire.
And so at the peace conference, people came together, and people like, go back to your heritage, Thomas Masaryk came. He was a Czech nationalist, and he came I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. But in any event, at that peace conference in Paris in 1919, arrangements were made for the various nationalities to have their territories in accordance with the diktat of the great powers. And in Yugoslavia, if I recall correctly, the South Slavs, the South Slavic peoples were split up into Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Macedonia, and at that time. So there was a kind of an artificial creation which lasted down until Hitler attacked. It was there in place as kind of an artificial creation of the great powers. But what they never did was figure out a way to set up a kind of a confederated form of government in which the individual nationalities felt that they were being justly treated. That, in other words, they never came up. The great powers never considered the great how, for example, a system of government that failed to recognize the individual national aspirations, the particularly language, culture, religion, how these things affected the attitudes of people. And so what
You
happened...
just take one, let me take one example of that, Tom. We talk about the Serbo-Croatian language. That one language that they have is written in two different ways, so that when the Serbs take that one language, they use the Cyrillic alphabet, different kind of alphabet, where the Croats would use a modified version of the Roman alphabet. So we've got the same language here, Serbo-Croatian as it's often called, but we got two different groups of people, the Orthodox Serbs and the Catholic Croats, writing it in a different fashion. Quite an amazing thing, I think, and it shows you this tremendous religious, political, ethnic split that occurs in this part of the world.
Yes, and it's fascinating, and of course, you just when you mention Serbo-Croatia, you're talking about the two dominant powers, the Serbs and the Croats. And as we've already established, the Serbs tend either to be Orthodox Christians or Muslims, and then in the Croatians, of course, tend to be Roman Catholics. By I think a huge percentage of the people in Croatia are Roman Catholic. But that artificial relationship of nations in Yugoslavia stayed pretty much as a kind of smoldering powder keg. And there's a few events we ought to mention before we get into the modern history. One is in 1928, a Croatian nationalist by the name of Stephen Radish was actually murdered in the National Assembly by Serbs, and the Serbian king decided we've had enough of this, and then attempted to set up. That was the first time that we heard the term in history Yugoslav. He tried to create a unified people in which everyone would be a South Slav person. And that the emphasis, rather than being on Croatian, Slovenia, Serbia, and so forth, would be on some kind of unified Southern Slavic culture. Well, it didn't work.
They actually set up a parliamentary constitution at that time in 1931.
That's correct.
So there was an effort to come up with one national government that would be this Yugoslavia, but still these ethnic groups remain dominant within this larger coalition.
I think that's true. I think it was King Alexander who did that in response to what at that time was very much. I think the point here is that history is now today replaying itself because we had the murder by a Serb of the Croatian nationalist Radish. Then in 1934, the Serbian king was assassinated, and it was so you see the cycle of violence that has led to today, and
that brings us up to the Second World War. Then 1941, Yugoslavia is invaded, occupied by Germany, and then you get Tito coming forth, Marshal Tito, who battles against the Nazis and so on, becomes a sort of folk hero in that sense. Eventually gets some civil war going on among the rival leaders. But that time of the Second World War becomes extremely important in this Serb relationship with Croatia, because right within Croatia during this time there was a fascist type of group that was I forget Ustazi, I think.
Ustazi, that's correct.
Those people, I mean, they were very nationalist. They were largely Catholic, and there was terrible atrocities done to the Serbs living in Croatia. There were hundreds of thousands of people killed or detained. There were, I think, 1/4 of the Orthodox churches were ruined. There were many clergy killed and so on.
Yes, I think that's
true.
So
that is helping. We really have to see this when you look at, well, what's motivating the Serbs now? I mean, what is happening? One thing clearly is this tremendous nationalism, this idea of getting back to what they call the Greater Serbia, where they see themselves as the power in the Balkans, which they have been in the past. But the other element is their feeling that they have been, in one way or another, put down and have suffered terribly. It's like, well, don't forget the rest of this history. During World War II, these Nazi-like people killed all of our Serbian people, not all of them, but a lot of our Serbian people right within Croatia. And we suffered in Bosnia in similar ways. And therefore, we are sort of balancing the scales here. So we have to keep that element in here. It's not like the Catholic Croats have completely clean hands in this whole history.
I think that's right. There's two strains that you brought up here that ought to be, I think, pursued a little bit. One is you're correct. At that time, the Ustashi was basically set up and encouraged by the Nazis, and its leader was a person who I would argue was probably a character very much in of the ilk of Milicevic, the Serbian former communist president who's now, as of Sunday, apparently has won the election. But the man was Anton Pavlich, who was a murderous killer. He was one of the most brutal figures in that awful, bloody part of the country. Now, he was a Croatian, and Tito was a Croatian. Now, you mentioned Tito. I don't think we can just... I think we need to stop for a moment on Tito, because Tito was a Croatian who led the partisans against the Nazis, and I would argue managed to, through his agents and with the help of the Kremlin, managed to convince, remember the Kremlin at that time was in alliance with us against the Nazis, and managed to convince Churchill and Roosevelt that he was a Democrat. Well, in fact, Tito was a communist dictator, very much in the Stalin ilk, and after the war set up concentration camps where everybody opposed him and killed off an awful lot of people. The point being that's
but
one part
points
of the
in the West because of his attempt to break with the Soviet system and Russian domination, and so often I think we in the West saw him as some ally precisely because he was willing to break up the communist monolithic bloc and go his own way. In fact, I remember people arguing at one time, and it's not all that long ago, as putting forward Tito's Yugoslavia as some sort of example of a working socialist economy. That people always said, well, show me one socialist economy that works. And I remember socialist authors writing about a decade or so ago. Tito died in 1980. And,
80, yes.
And I remember them arguing that here was a workable socialist economy that we in the West could look to as a model. So there were a number of reasons why people saw Tito in a positive light. I think many of them really misguided because he was a murderous dictator, as you pointed out, and really was not successful in really pulling these ethnic groups together at all. It was all by force and violence that it was kept together. I
think you mentioned the Ustashi, we've now mentioned Tito and the partisans. These are all elements in there. I think also we should mention the Chetniks. This was a Serbian group, also fought as a resistance organization against Hitler, but spent a lot of time fighting against the Croats. In other words, you had mixed up not only the resistance against Nazis, but you also had all this nationalist animosity and history wrapped up in these movements. And so you had the Chetniks were killing Croatians at that time, and the Croatians were under the Ustashi were killing off Serbs, and so that I think does bring us down to the Second World War.
Yes,
and the events, of course, after the Second World War, that area down until the breakup of the Eastern European bloc was basically a result of what Tito brought together, his kind of strange brand of Marxism.
There's one thing we should note, Tom, here, which I think is of interest in this religious thing, and that is that in many ways, in Bosnia and in that area generally, the religious groups did live in relative peace. It's not the same as you would look in the Middle East and say, look at the problems between the Israelis and the Palestinians, or in Northern Ireland, the long-standing troubles between Protestants and Catholics. You have many examples of people in Bosnia who actually lived in harmony with one another. You will hear stories now reported of teachers, Muslim teachers, who taught Serbian Orthodox students and thought they were friends. One woman reporting that the best man in her wedding, a Muslim woman, saying the best man in her wedding was Serbian Orthodox. And now these are the people, very same people, the individuals, not as a group, who have turned on her and been one of her persecutors. That's one of the stories that's come out. But we had some sort of religious peace there. I mean, I think it papered over a lot of problems. But the cry, and what we want to see about this, the cry of the Serbian Orthodox is beware of Islamic fundamentalism. And that's why they have to be careful and have this ethnic cleansing. And I think that really is off the mark, because by and large, the 47% of the Muslim population in Bosnia, 47% of the whole country, it is the dominant group, has been rather peaceful and conciliatory, and not the kind of people interested in the thinking of the Iranian-type fundamentalist outlook that we've been so worried about. And I think that needs to be brought into the mix. It's almost sort of strange and mysterious the way this religious group tension has arisen here after quite a period of relatively peaceful coexistence.
Yeah, and I give a lot of the discredit for that to Milicevic, who has played upon nationalist discontents and fears, and that goes right back almost into the Habsburg era and the Metternich's announced policy of keeping the ignorance and the intolerance and the hatred of one group for another as an instrument of government. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing almost as if we were in a time warp, and we're seeing this demagogue, this terrible fellow, Milicevic, now attempting to play on simmering nationalist hatreds and using it.
Tom, we're going to have to stop with many questions left unanswered. We began with the idea that Bosnia is a terrible situation. There's atrocities and terrible things going on. We cannot be blind to that, and something needs to be done, and people can't just analyze it. We have to act on it. But as a matter of fact, we do need some historical perspective, and we've tried to see a bit of that and how we got to this situation. It's politically involved. It involves religious differences, and it's going to be a very complex situation that we need to try to solve.